Imagine standing beside the sea. Behind you, an entire city is burning. In front of you, there is nowhere to go. Thousands of people are packed along the waterfront, carrying whatever they manage to save. Children are crying. Families are searching for one another. Ships sit in the harbor as flames move through Smyrna behind them. For those on shore, the sea offers both hope and uncertainty. This was September 1922. The city was Smyrna, one of the great port cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. Before Smyrna became a symbol of destruction, it was a city full of life, movement, commerce, and people. Ships arrived constantly at its harbor. Merchants traded goods from across the Mediterranean, making Smyrna a busy center of commerce. Different languages could be heard in its streets. Greeks, Armenians, Turks, Jews, and Levantines lived and worked throughout the city. Schools, churches, businesses, and foreign institutions filled Smyrna. For many residents, daily life continued as though disaster was unimaginable. But beneath this cosmopolitan life was a region being pulled apart by war, nationalism, and competing claims over territory. By 1922, the old order was collapsing. The Ottoman Empire was breaking apart, and Smyrna stood inside a dangerous political storm. The Greco-Turkish War was approaching its final stage. Across Anatolia, armies moved while civilians were caught between a rapidly changing world. Smyrna stood on the western coast of Anatolia, beside the Aegean Sea. Its location made the city strategically important. Then, in September 1922, the war finally reached Smyrna. Turkish nationalist forces advanced while the Greek army retreated. The Greek army was retreating. Turkish nationalist forces were advancing rapidly, and civilians moved through an increasingly uncertain landscape. On September 9th, Turkish troops entered the city. For the people of Smyrna, the arrival of the army changed everything. Some welcomed the end of Greek occupation. Others feared what might happen next. Nobody knew how terrible the coming days would become. The city was suddenly filled with soldiers, refugees, and civilians who had nowhere else to go. People watched the streets anxiously. Families gathered together, carried belongings, and tried to understand what was happening around them. Then, on September 13th, smoke began rising over Smyrna. Something had changed, and the city was entering its darkest days. And then, 4 days later, something happened that would transform Smyrna forever. The fire had begun. The fire was no longer a distant threat. It was moving through the city, spreading from neighborhood to neighborhood. People poured into the streets, carrying whatever they could save as smoke and flames grew behind them. Some carried children. Others carried possessions they had spent years collecting. In the chaos, ordinary life disappeared within hours, and some had nothing left to carry. They fled with only the clothes they wore and the people beside them. Above them, the sky itself seemed to disappear beneath the smoke as flames consumed more of the city. There was only one direction left, toward the sea. Thousands of people moved through the streets toward the waterfront. But when they reached the waterfront, they discovered another problem. The shoreline was already crowded with desperate people. The sea was in front of them, but the burning city was behind them, leaving the crowd trapped between two worlds. And the fire was behind them, growing larger as smoke covered the sky and flames illuminated the city. For thousands of people, the ships in the harbor represented the possibility of escape from a city they could no longer save. But the waterfront was already crowded with people who had nowhere else to go. Thousands waited together beside the sea. People searched desperately for relatives. They had become separated from in the chaos, calling names through the smoke and confusion. Children who had recently lived ordinary lives were now surrounded by smoke, fire, strangers, and frightened adults. Across the water, ships waited in the harbor. For the refugees, those distant vessels represented the possibility of survival. They were close enough to see, but reaching safety was still uncertain. The crowd waited for someone to help. Being able to see a ship was not the same as reaching safety. The waterfront remained dangerously crowded. Behind the crowd, the fire continued moving through neighborhood after neighborhood, consuming buildings and changing Smyrna forever. Homes, businesses, and entire neighborhoods were disappearing as the fire spread through the densely built city. For those standing on the waterfront, there was nowhere familiar left to return to. Their old lives were disappearing behind them. The question was no longer whether Smyrna could be saved. The question was how many people could escape. As the situation became desperate, ships began taking part in the effort to evacuate people trapped in Smyrna. On the ships, sailors prepared for the enormous task ahead, while smoke from the burning city filled the horizon. On the shore, thousands waited for their chance to escape, holding children, bags, blankets, and whatever possessions remained. One by one, families began leaving the waterfront and climbing aboard ships, carrying only what they could manage. For some children, the ship was the first moment of safety they had seen in days of fear and uncertainty. But even as they escaped, many could still see their city burning behind them as the ships moved away. The harbor slowly filled with vessels carrying people away from Smyrna, while smoke continued rising over the city. The numbers were enormous. More than 200,000 people were evacuated from Smyrna during September, according to American diplomatic records. But evacuation did not mean returning to normal life. These people were leaving behind homes, possessions, businesses, and communities. They were no longer simply residents of Smyrna. They were now refugees. But escaping the flames was only the beginning.